we are live, sir.
Okay. Very good morning to all. Hope all are good and safe with your family. And continuing with the program schedule, today is the ninth day of the program. And on behalf of the whole organizing committee, I welcome you all on ninth day schedule of the FDP. The topic of today's schedule is the gendered impact of COVID-19 in India. And today, for this session, I would like to introduce you all with a very well-known academic personality, Professor Nata Dhruvi ma'am, and his academic profiles will be discussed. So, ma'am is currently a senior lecturer and director at Center for Global Women's Studies, National University of Ireland, Galway. Dr. Nata Dhruvi ma'am, an international development expert and feminist economist, has 20 plus years of experience in gender development and empowerment. She has extensive experience with. Is there any difficulty? No. Is it audible? I think. Okay, I am continuing. So, ma'am, she has extensive experience with your state and ILO database for understanding women's economic participation, wage gaps, and pension gaps to produce relevant reports and papers in the last 10 years. Dr. Durvi has significant research experience on the issue of domestic violence, particularly intimate partner violence. She was PI for the sixth year, 2014 to 20, DFID funded project, What Works to Prevent Violence, Economic and Social Cost of VEWG, a multi-country study in the Global South. She also has expertise in gender budgeting and has provided technical assistance to undertake gender responsive budget analysis to determine government resource allocation for addressing violence against women and girls. She was the lead author for a 2013 World Bank discussion paper on intimate partner violence, economic cost and consequences. As lead author, she led the development of a conceptual framework, links between IPV and economic growth, provided a roadmap of costing methodologies with varying level of data availability, and estimated empirically sectoral output loss in Vietnam. She also has extensive experience on issues of older working women, focusing on the challenges of older women's access to pensions and understanding the impacts of European policies to extend working life. She was co-PI for a cost action IS 1409, a research networking involving 141 researchers from 34 countries, examining the gender and health impacts of extended working life policies in Western Europe from 2015 to 19. Talking about his professional experience, currently ma'am is a director of Center for Global Women's Studies program since 2010, and previous assignments were the director Gender Violence and Rights, International Center for Research on Women, Washington DC, Joint Director, Center for Development of Imaging Technology, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, India. Ma'am is PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, graduated from Houston, Texas, Rice University, and postgraduated from Canada, University of Alberta, Edmonton. Ma'am has already supervised many of the research projects, fellowships, and consultancies, more than five. And additionally, ma'am has many of the publication of international repute. So we all welcome ma'am to deliver his points on the specific topic of gender impact of COVID-19 in India. I welcome ma'am to the session.
Thank you very much. So I would like to share my screen and begin the lecture, if that is okay with you.
Yes, ma'am, yes.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be speaking about women work and COVID-19. Is gender equality stalled? We're living in very unusual, unprecedented times. And COVID 19 has had the impact of unmasking the inequalities, the underlying inequalities that operate in societies across the globe. And it's an important time to understand what has been the impacts of COVID 19, as well as to think about what is the future direction. So, in this lecture, we'll explore the impacts of COVID 19 on women and their work globally as well as in India. Gender inequality is pervasive across the world, shaping women's access to opportunities, well being, and safety and security. There are three widely recognized measures of gender inequality. First is the level of women's participation in economic activity, or what we call the labor force participation rate, the burden of care work, the unpaid care work that many women do across the world within their homes, and the experience of violence broadly, and in particular, intimate partner violence, which is also known as spousal abuse and domestic violence. COVID-19 crisis emerged as a global pandemic by March 2020. It's just 1 year and 3 months or 2 months, with the warning of WHO on March 11, 2020, that there was a global pandemic. There is an immediate concern among feminist researchers how women would be affected, and would there be a disproportionate burden on them. Based on the conceptual understanding of the dynamics of gender inequality and some of the early evidence as lockdowns were imposed in country after country, several stylized facts have been identified. So the first has been that women are disproportionately overrepresented in sectors that were hit hardest by the initial response of lockdown across the globe. These sectors are wholesale and retail, hotel and food, personal services, education, and in fact, the health sector. Women who could not work remotely lost jobs, and those who could work remotely had hours of work change. This was in fact known globally as a maybe this COVID-19 is a she crisis, whereas the 2008 financial crisis was known as a he crisis. All women faced increased burden of care work, affecting their productivity and emotional well-being. Essential workers had particularly difficult challenges to negotiate care work. However, there is some evidence across the globe that men's contribution to childcare has somewhat increased. Experienced increased risk of domestic violence, so serious that the Secretary General, UN Secretary General, called it a shadow pandemic. And country after country, the combined impact seems to be that there are signs of women withdrawing from the labor force. The Irish data showed that in a period of six months, there were 71,000 women who exited the labor force, not just lost their jobs, but withdrew completely from the labor force. And this is a trend that we're seeing in many countries. So the structure of this lecture will focus on two aspects of the impacts of COVID-19. First is actually the impact of COVID-19 on migration, internal and external, as migration is crucial for the poor and middle class globally and in India also. Second, then we'll turn to the specific gendered impacts of COVID-19 in India and the future of women's work. The last 4 decades of globalization has been marked by an increase in migration, and migration which is both internal migration and international migration. What we see across the world is that COVID-19 has had particularly stark impact on these people who move from place to place seeking a better life and opportunities to work and live with peace and security. And we saw in India with sheer unprecedented consequence for internal migrants in the lockdown that was imposed on March 25th by Narendra Modi at midnight, where hundreds of millions of internal migrants walked back hundreds of kilometers to their native villages over the subsequent months. Many were hounded by police as they were breaking the law. Hundreds died on the way, and thousands were herded into relief camps. And there is now increasing evidence to show that this lockdown and the incredible impact it had on internal migrants also then continued to fuel the COVID crisis. And recently we have seen the impact of panchayat elections, where internal migrants were brought back to their villages. And there is a considerable debate whether it's these large movements of people has contributed to the second pandemic in India. Now, in terms of international migration, we see that countries with the highest number of COVID cases are heavily dependent on foreign medical professionals. In UK, 1/3 of doctors and nurses are foreign born. And you see, even in the United States, 1/3 of the doctors in the US are foreign born. And it is throughout the Western Europe that you see this high dependency on international migrants. Migrant women, health, and social care workers faced increased risk of violence and harassment and had inadequate PPE. It was not only that migrant foreign migrant professionals were responsible for healthcare, they were at a greater risk of COVID-19 because they had inadequate supplies of PPE. And essentially, they were overworked and inadequately protected. But migrants are not only present in the health sector. Migrant women constitute a significant share among sectors that were most affected by the crisis, such as services and sales. And you see that the percentage of foreign-born workers in services and sales sectors was fairly high, ranging from 23% to about 14% in UK. But among those, then the proportion of women is extremely high. And similarly, you see the same pattern in terms of agriculture, forestry, and fishery workers. In Europe, 13% of all key essential workers outside of health and social care in the European Union are immigrants. And these workers were at a greater disadvantage as they experienced significant job losses and had more restrictive access to social protection. One of the issues with migrants is that they are seen as outsiders and they're not well integrated into the social protection systems in many of these advanced countries. And migrant workers were, in fact, actually at a greater risk of COVID-19. Low-skilled labor migrants in crowded dormitories have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And examples from Saudi Arabia and Singapore, where ministries of health have provided official data on the migration status of individuals who tested positive, show the differential exposure to the virus of the migrant population. According to the Saudi Ministry of Health, 75% of all new confirmed cases as of May 7th, 2020, were among migrants. So migrants provided essential services, but they were the first to be actually affected by the COVID-19. So there was a disproportionate burden on migrant workers' health, well-being, and livelihoods, and that of their families and communities were disproportionately impacted. Yet these workers are predominantly excluded from government policy responses to the crisis. They're excluded from accessing COVID-19 measures implemented in the countries in which they work, including financial support packages, wage subsidies, income support, and social protection. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the COVID-19 crisis has been that governments have actually engaged in physical spending. But unfortunately, many migrants in many of the European countries did not necessarily benefit from that fiscal spending. And they face burdens in terms of migration, immigration, and employment laws that limit their access to healthcare. So they not only did not benefit from social care policies, but they also did not benefit from the healthcare system, and they were likely to face consequences in terms of their future security in the place of migration. There was, as we've seen across the world in reports of newspapers, that the increase in anti immigrant racism and violence and attacks on immigrants. And the most vulnerable of all these immigrants are women domestic workers. Among all migrant workers, the most vulnerable are migrant women domestic workers, who number 11.5 million globally across North America, Europe, and the Arab region. A majority of the women domestic workers migrate to the US, to various European countries, and particularly the Arab region. Many of these women have lost their employment due to their employers' anxiety about transmission. Without income and work permits invalid and borders closed, many were trapped in their countries of migration with no income and no housing. And what we see is that women domestic workers from the global south have been critical in supporting social provisioning in the global north. So they play an essential role in the way that the economies of the West are organized. With a growing aging population, it is the migrant domestic workers who've actually stepped in to support the social infrastructure for caring for the aged. And of the 150 million migrant workers, 8% are domestic workers. And this rises to 13% among women migrant workers. Around the world, world estimates indicate that 72% of domestic workers lost their employment, particularly in the global north. Under COVID restrictions, many were caught within their employers' homes. So those on sponsorship visas were particularly hard hit. If the employment was severe, they could not access unemployment benefits. They were unable to qualify for emergency response measures, nor could they look for another employment or even leave the country due to travel restrictions. Being vulnerable, they were at even greater risk of violence. And this, the UN Women reports have documented the increased risk of violence for women migrant domestic workers. So this is at the global level, and we see that women migrant workers, and particularly women migrant domestic workers, were at increased risk of COVID-19 and the negative impacts of COVID-19. So, what have been the impacts for Indian women? The first has been the deterioration in healthcare. I know that today India is facing an incredible crisis with many COVID at risk patients not being able to even access oxygen. And COVID 19 has exposed the inadequate investment that the Indian government has made in the last 10 years in the health sector. With now recognizing that 1% investment of your GDP into health sector does not cut it. The health sector is unable to respond. And we saw this right from the beginning of COVID-19 within India in terms of the impacts on healthcare. The Population Foundation of India did a rapid assessment in 2020 and indicated the following. The fear of being infected kept many from accessing services at health facilities and led to the resistance in interacting with the ASHAs and ANMs on family planning during home visits. So the progress that India was making in terms of family planning was actually initially had a difficulty because people began to be afraid of interacting with the ASHAs and ANMs. Nearly 50% or more FLWs reported that women were not accessing antenatal care services, and 70% or more reported beneficiaries were not accessing immunization services. So, in the first phase of the COVID-19 in India, was that people were not accessing healthcare because of the fears around the potential risk of contracting COVID-19. In the second phase, in the second wave, what we're seeing is that people, even trying to access the healthcare system, cannot access and they're dying. Increase in unwanted pregnancies and unsafe abortions were due to inadequate supply of contraceptives and limited service provision. So, what this suggests to us, and we'll know at the end of the day, is the impact of COVID-19 on the progress that India has made in terms of safe pregnancies, uh, bringing down the infant mortality rate, and having access to family planning services widely available. If this gets reversed, then there is a likelihood that there can be fairly serious consequences for the progress India has made in terms of family planning. Of course, the most serious impacts have been the impacts on employment and the loss of paid work. Now, India is characterized by a particularly low female labor force participation rate. India has one of the lowest in the world at about 27%. And subsequent rounds of NSS have shown us how the participation rate has not really significantly increased, and it has basically stalled. Women constitute about 49% of the Indian population, but their contribution to economic output is only 18%, with a 35% gender pay gap. This is statistics cited by Ashwini Deshpande in a 2020 article. And she looked at some of the initial, in the first wave, what was the impact of COVID-19 on women's employment, and indicates that as per the CMIE Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, the CPHS data, 4 out of 10 women lost jobs in India, and 17 million women lost their jobs during the nationwide lockdown in March and April. And in fact, in garment factories, such as in the Tirupur hub, women were not returning to work, and factories were functioning with a labor shortage of 45%. So after the first lockdown, as employment again began to pick up, we see for the first time the trend of women not returning to work, again, because of either the burden of care work at home or the fears of contracting COVID-19. Of course, India, when we say paid employment, where are women working? Women are largely working in the informal sector. And the informal sector bore the brunt of first the lockdown and then the slow recovery of the economy from September onwards. And now, again, the second wave, which has also significantly impacted the ability of people to sustain their livelihood. So there has been significant income loss as women have been unable to do the vending, the small petty trading, domestic work, casual work, etc. So a study by Chakrabarty has suggested that 83% of the respondents that they surveyed, mainly construction workers, waste pickers, and home-based workers, had witnessed substantial decline in their earnings. Migrant women workers and other casual workers were dependent on money lenders, facing increasing debt. And in the current second wave, medical care is out of the reach of the majority of the poor. What are we seeing in the second wave now is that people are begging for oxygen tanks, the cylinders, and the price has risen incredibly. There's a black market. Informal workers have lost their income. They're increasingly dependent upon money lenders to tide them over. Money lenders are not any longer willing to provide loans because the inability of the poor to actually repay these loans. And what we are facing, and which we need to talk about and document much more seriously, is there a kind of a pauperization of unprecedented proportions that is happening that may in fact lead to what one can say a cleansing of the poor being unable to have any income, unable to access healthcare, and therefore dying in larger numbers. Across the world and in India, what we see is the most significant impact of COVID-19 has been the increased care work. Now, across the world, care work is primarily seen as a woman's responsibility within the private space of the home. So even before the pandemic, we know that unpaid care work in the home is highly gender skewed. Um, Data from the Indian Time Use Survey has actually shown how much women spend nearly 300 minutes in unpaid care work in the home compared to about 200 minutes by men. 93% of men spent up to 14 hours per week in unpaid work in the home compared to 62% of women. And about 9% of women reported spending more than 50 hours. This is more than a working week is spent in unpaid care work within the home. And what has been the impact after the pandemic? The number of hours have increased for both men and women, and even more so for women. So the pandemic and the lockdown actually did increase the number of hours that men were spending in unpaid care work. In the post lockdown, nearly 25% of women spent more than 50 hours of work on housework, and particularly this was high for married employed women. So while men did increase some contribution to care work within the households, there was even a greater increase. So that relatively, there was even a greater increase post lockdown for women spending many more hours in care work. As we saw pre lockdown, only 9% of women reported spending more than 50 hours. In post lockdown, it came to 25% of women reported spending more than 50 hours. And this is, more than the working week. Overall, women are more burdened across all parameters, including marital status, employment status, average monthly income, and their hours of employment. So while we see that green shoots of hope with some increase by men in unpaid care work within the home, the reality is that it is only increased for women. And this is how women talked about the unpaid care work that they have having to do in the post-lockdown phase. The pandemic has created so much extra work in terms of sanitizing everything from milk packets to vegetables and fruits After buying vegetables and fruits, we soak them in a tub of water for about 2 to 3 hours, then wipe them with a sanitized cloth, then use them for consumption. It is time consuming considering we are a family of 5 people. Or another one, a woman speaks, the assumption that my brother might be infected with COVID-19 increased all our workloads. Most of all, my mother's making separate immunity boosting food items for him, serving him food, cleaning his clothes, maintaining everything related to his cleanliness and hygiene. Plus, she was also regularly monitoring his overall health and her own health in isolation to all of us, in case the infection spread to her as well. Me and my dad were busy procuring medicines, consulting doctors, preparing for the day if things get worse. So, what we see is overall, it's not just lockdown, but COVID 19 has increased the level of unpaid care work that has to be done within the home. And this is nothing new. This kind of increased burden of care work when there is an epidemic or a serious health crisis has been found in research when we have looked at HIV/AIDS. And much of the health system, in fact, functions on the basis of this assumption that women will, in fact, take up much of the informal care that is required to sustain the well being of patients. And that health, that kind of work is only in addition to already what women have to do within the home. Then finally, another serious impact has been the increase in domestic violence, which is again as has been found across the world. Excuse me for 1 minute. Reports from the National Commission for Women indicated 100% increase in calls from 123 complaints before the lockdown to 239 in the immediate weeks after the lockdown. And there were similar levels of increase across different parts of India, cutting north, east, west, and south. I just want to go back to domestic violence. The eruption of domestic violence, along with COVID-19, should not be a surprise. We do know that gender inequality is fuels domestic violence. And in a crisis where stress and tension is increasing, it is logical that unless there is uh, a, a targeted response to address the issues of stress, that domestic violence will increase. What was surprising is how policymakers across the world were so surprised that domestic violence increased in the lockdown phase, with no understanding of how domestic violence operates and what are the factors that fuel it. So, one thing to think about is the response to COVID-19 in India gender sensitive. So, we've seen that there are some very significant negative impacts of COVID-19, but has the response by the government actually taken into account these likely gender differentiated impacts? Unfortunately, there is no evidence that we do have a gender sensitive response. Few of the schemes that have addressed the issue of women's employment nor a clear commitment to use the MGREANN, I don't know how to exactly say it, but the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Program to sustain women's casual employment. Now, the government did announce a series of easing of credit restrictions for micro, small, and medium enterprises. That was one of the first fiscal spending measures that the government announced. But worryingly, there was no mention of special provisions for women owned micro enterprises or the sectors that have a concentration of women's businesses. There has been some promotion of self help groups to produce mass hand sanitizers, protective gear, community kitchens, etc. But the serious question is, for how long will this be sustained? And how much income is actually generated through self-help groups' production of these kinds of goods? What is the level of, what is the cost, and what is the actual income that would be generated? And we know that micro enterprises often lead to women and those involved in micro enterprises to be just above the poverty level. It's not a guarantee that you will be able to generate sufficient income to grow your business to actually begin to move up the scale of income. And then the response by the national government was totally inadequate in terms of having any focus on domestic violence. It's actually in some of the state governments that chief ministers, etc., spoke and governments engaged in some campaign around domestic violence. Uh, Particularly famous was the campaign that was launched in Kerala with Pinarayi Vijayan actually saying that this cannot be an excuse to beat up women. Um, and there was a very focused campaign to try and reduce domestic violence as well as increase the level of response by the police to calls for help. Overall, what do we see is the longer impact on work? And this is not just India, but just if we pull back out from India and look at the globally, what has been the impact? The World Bank and ILO have data suggest to us that there has been a sharp impact on small businesses run by women, with 25% of self employed women closing their businesses. And this is across the world. This would be very similar within India. ILO estimates that 140 million jobs will have been lost, with women disproportionately losing jobs by 19%. What does loss of employment or job actually mean? Well, it has a significant impact in countries that have pension systems, because this will impact the ability of women to actually provide for their future pension. So it'll have impacts on pension accumulation. And for countries with no well developed pension system, it means that there is no future security for women in their old age. And there's also disturbing evidence that girls are more likely to drop out of education. And this will have significant impacts on future work participation of women. If we have said that globally and within different countries, the gender equality agenda has been progressing in terms of the increased access of girls to education, COVID-19 may actually begin to put a break on that progress. And that progress in education has very significant long term consequences for women's future work participation. All of this also has been now uh, summarized in this World Bank projection of the impact on poverty. So there has been, the World Bank has suggested that there would be a much sharper increase of the number of people below poverty line by 2021 than what has been the trend that was being projected based on existing data. So before we were projecting that the that poverty rate would decline and the million numbers of people below poverty would be declining and would be well below 600 million. And now the forecasts are that they would actually be an increase and may even be as high as about 750 million people. So therefore, the progress from 2015 may in fact be reversed so that we'll have greater number of people in poverty than in 2015. And this is very serious given that we've talked about the global sustainable development goals and the targets that we've had on reducing poverty. It's not only that poverty will increase, but there is projections that the long-term impact on poverty gender gap will also worsen. So that there is the feeling that the gender gap by 2030 of women is going to be increased numbers of in poverty. So from a gap of about 11 million, the gap is going to increase to more than 10 million. So advances in gender inequality are under threat with decline in women's work, participation, and rise in DV. The recovery for job loss would likely take another 5 to 8 years based on past crises, such as the financial crisis. In India, it is likely that men's recovery of employment will be faster than women's. Additionally, domestic violence undermines productivity, and inadequate services to survivors will further reduce output for businesses. Much of my work has been focused on showing that domestic violence actually has a significant productivity impact and that it leads to productivity loss. And if it is not addressed, that it then has the potential to undermine the growth of economies. And so COVID-19, with domestic violence as being the twin or the shadow pandemic, can actually create a scenario where the forecast for growth might be actually severe overestimates because the impact of domestic violence is not considered in those estimates or projections. COVID-19, more than any other crisis, has really shown us that it is absolutely essential that we have social security systems, robust social protection, and that maybe even universal basic income with the direct payment to women is needed to support poor households that are often headed by women across the world. Now, internationally, there has been a growing discourse around universal basic income as the floor that has to be there to ensure that households who are below, just above, and maybe a bit more above can actually sustain and have an opportunity to grow. COVID-19 has also underlined the importance of investment in social care infrastructure. This crisis has shown without doubt that care, health, and the economy are closely interlinked, and that if it is not enough to have physical infrastructure, buildings, factories, roads, electricity, etc. But we need the social infrastructure, the social care infrastructure. And this is now even the World Bank has, and IMF, of all the institutions, has said that unless there is investment in social care infrastructure, the projections of growth are probably quite illusory. So there is a, a call and a fundamental need to reorient macroeconomic policies to enable the care economy to thrive. We cannot leave care work to the realm of the private space. Care work is essential for the reproduction of the labor force. And in that sense, it is essentially a public duty. It's a public activity. And governments have to facilitate care work being done in a way that is sustainable, that does not deteriorate and deplete the resources of women, to be actively engaged both in the economy as well as in the care. So basically, what I would argue, and increasingly feminist economists, feminist thinkers, and those concerned about gender equality are arguing, is that there needs to be a reconfiguration of care work. Now, there is, as I said earlier, some green shoots that men are engaging a bit more in the daily work during the pandemic. But from that, is there an optimistic conclusion that gender equality is improved and that there's an incipient transformation of gender norms? I would argue that it indicates the potential for some transformation, but that regardless of who does care work, whether it is men or whether it is women, there's a fundamental question as should care work continue to be the purview of the private world, of the family? Should we move to a more public care infrastructure that is funded by government and the public sector? Care work is essential for the economy to function. Care work is essential for the private sector to be profitable. And therefore, the fundamental dynamic between care work and the market work has to be reconfigured, reconceptualized, and develop a infrastructure that is the responsibility of both government as well as the private sector. Finally, the COVID-19 has also raised certain broader implications for globalization that need to be considered in some depth. With millions of migrant workers returning home, are we entering a new phase of closed borders? There is now, obviously, with the digital world and the digital space becoming more prominent, there has been talk about, well, why is there the need for people to actually migrate from one country to another? The new world economic order and the restructuring of global production can be done through the digital space. And so that would be then the closing down of borders. And so that we need to consider, is there a possibility that the international division of labor is going to be virtual and no longer about people migrating to countries? And will this be even faster with automation and robotization expanding at a rapid speed? So that the future and the structure of the future world is up for real reconsideration. And that we need to think about these larger issues and not just only focus on the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on women and work. Thank you.
Ma'am, it was wonderful. Personally, I feel that I've learned a lot just to think about the day-to-day life challenges of the women, of the migrant workers. Ma'am, we have some questions for the participants. One by one, I'll be putting that. If you're comfortable, we are continuing with that. Please unmute yourself, ma'am. You are muted.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. The first question is how to raise awareness level of rural women about the available healthcare facilities so that they can fight this current healthcare emergencies properly.
Okay. So, I mean, I think one of the issues is obviously it's the lack of awareness of availability of facilities. And we have done a lot in terms of actually having these sort of barefoot professionals, right? In terms of the A&Ms and the community health workers, but they have to be supported and given the tools to actually go out and do much more significant outreach campaigns. And I would really point to the experience of Kerala. Kerala has resolved this problem. Kerala does have a healthcare uh, professionals, personnel, and investment in the healthcare system to do this kind of significant outreach so that they are visiting individual homes, they're providing even healthcare in homes, not only at the health facilities per se. So it's about having the political will first to invest the resources that are needed to have a significant campaign and support these local level health professionals to actually engage and do their work properly. And if they did that, you would see that rural women would access health facilities. It's building trust. Trust just doesn't happen out of the blue.
Ma'am, the next question is what is the impact of increasing unpaid work of the women on the national income?
Okay, so it's a that's a dicey question because at one level, if there's increased unpaid care work within the home and we actually account it and monetize it, then there would be an increase in national income because this is output that's not being measured, right? But this output that's leading to an increase in national income, is it leading to increased income for the women? Because it's unpaid, though the output is increasing, the very nature and the exploitation that's inherent in this is that it's unpaid. So you don't have an improvement in women's lives. You have a recognition that there is this important work that's not paid. So I think the argument that it might increase national income is a slightly problematic argument, unless we say that if it increases national income, there needs to be some basic income that is provided to all women. I know that Kamala Hassan was talking about in the election campaign in Tamil Nadu. He raised this whole issue of a payment for women, but it's not just a payment for household work. I think what I would argue and what many other economists are arguing straight from Amartya Sen or Stiglitz, etc., is that the concept of a basic universal income, and that would take into would begin to address this whole notion of the unpaid care work also, and that's what's important to do.
Oh, this was a good one. Ma'am, the next question is what should be the government policy response to safeguard the interest of women in India as they are the most vulnerable group in COVID-19 pandemic?
So there are a whole set of policies that Indian feminist economists have been advocating for. Uh, the first and foremost is when you announce any measure, that the first thing is if you announce any measure to ensure that you've done some level of disaggregated analysis to understand what would be the impact of that policy on men and women. Just simple, basic. First, think of that. Two, we know where women are working. We know what type of employment they're engaged in. So we need to think through when we announce employment measures, are we specifically targeting women's employment? If you're not targeting specifically women's employment, then you would end up basically what we saw in the financial crisis is recovery is only of male employment and not women's employment. That's the first thing. Second thing is to really think through the whole rural employment schemes and how can we ensure that women's engagement in the labor market is facilitated through having public care infrastructure. Because if you don't have this care infrastructure, women find it a bit difficult to sustain their activity. They might come in, and that's what we see, right? Rural women dip in and out of the labor market. And to sustain it, we need to have this public care infrastructure. And so that's the central policy that people should be fighting for.
Ma'am, I think you are live from Ireland, Galway, but the people are asking the question relevant to the Indian wedding situation right now in India. What is happening? The 50 peoples are allowed only. So the one question is in relation to this issue came over here that given the less number of guests allowed in wedding, is there a case that number of weddings has increased? Has it also led to an increase in the cases of marital rape and divorce rates in newlyweds?
Okay,
Should I
I
repeat the
can't
question, ma'am?
answer that.
Or
I can't answer that
okay.
because I don't have the empirical data. But I would say that it's not about the violence within the home is not limited only to the violence that women experience by their husbands, but there is violence that women experience by their family members, parents, brothers, uncles, etc. So what we do see is that the pandemic has had a significant impact on the level of violence that is experienced by women from different members of the family, by partners as well as other family members. Even in Ireland, and the new form of violence that we're seeing is actually the whole internet cyber violence. So there's a technology facilitated abuse that is happening globally, where cell phones, access to the internet, etc., have facilitated uh, a new form of stalking and abuse. And this is being done also by family members as well as by outsiders. So the pandemic has increased violence, not because it's reduced number of weddings or what. I didn't quite follow the logic of that question, but it increased violence because women's ability to move, their mobility, has been highly restricted. And that is an important factor that's fueling this violence. And so that needs to be thought about much more seriously.
Ma'am, I think one question is already been answered. What is your take on overall picture of marital rape and legalities associated with it? So if
Well,
you want to add something in this question, or we should move
yeah,
ahead to
I
the next.
just want to say marital
Yes.
rape
Okay.
is unacceptable. It should be illegal. And the problem is again the mindset that says that marriage is actually fundamentally about a household, and that a male partner acquiring a unpaid laborer who will also service all the sexual needs. And unless that mindset about what marriage is changes, you're not going to do away with marital rape. You can have it as that it's illegal, that's important, but it's this fundamental mindset that has to change about what marriage is. So that I wanted to add that in.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, as suffering by the impact of COVID-19, most of the women are using their skills to earn. Should this include in the growth of the economy?
Just repeat that. Just please repeat.
As suffering by the impact of COVID-19, most of the women are using their skills to earn. And should this include in the growth of the economy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if women are using various skills to sustain some form of livelihood, then this should be recognized as valuable economic activity that should be promoted and facilitated. Uh, and that only is a way to, it's also about, there's argument in India. I think Kannan and someone else recently 2019 they wrote an article about that India is having a jobless growth. So it's about what kind of growth do we want. Is it a growth that is uh, high capital intensive growth, or is it labor intensive growth? I mean, the struggle in India has been, how do we create a growth that actually creates employment opportunities for the vast majority of the Indian people? What we've traditionally had is, especially in the last 30 years, with the liberalization and post liberalization phase, has been not necessarily a labor intensive growth pattern. It has been fairly high intensive. And India, because it has this huge population, is able to get by and have growth on the basis of a very small, narrow base of consumer demand. That is, of the middle class, upper middle class, and the very rich. And this is, standard debate in Indian economics. So if you don't have a growth that is targeting labor intensive to expand employment opportunities, you will not have a growth that will actually sustain the livelihoods of the poor. And that's what I'm trying to say. COVID-19 has come, and unless we really discuss and rethink the policies and the nature of growth in the economy, we are going to see a cleansing, a genocide that is going to unfold of the poor, of the very poor. They're dying. They are dying, and they will die. And this is what we saw when feudalism transitioned into capitalism, the massive death of the poor. And we need to wake up and say, is that what we want in the 21st century? How do we
Very true, ma'am.
re-envision the growth?
Ma'am, one more question is there. Which social group of women, female, girls, child affected more severely by domestic violence during COVID-19 pandemic, and why?
So, what we are seeing is that women, intimate partner violence is what has really increased. So, that is married or partnered women. They may be young, They may be old, they may be middle aged, but partnered, okay, whether husband or boyfriend or whatever relationship there is. The girl child and the violence against the girl child hasn't, the data hasn't actually really come out that much as to whether they have faced increased violence. But you would think, in given our norms, given the social dynamics, that girl child in a phase of lockdown and this kind of social uncertainty would be facing increasing restrictions within the home and would be burdened with taking up the responsibility for some of the domestic work that is increasing. And so the supposition that they might be suffering is there. We don't have the data to say that they are suffering the most, but we do know that women who are partnered, regardless of what their age is, are at an increased risk of violence.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is in relation to that's why I changed the sequence of these questions. So the person is asking, how can we prevent and avoid the gender inequality in this time of global pandemic?
I think I just said that we have to have macroeconomic policies that actually begin to consider much more seriously the impact of policies on women and men. They have a gender differentiated analysis of impacts. And in that way, we can begin to identify policies that are beneficial for both women and men. And that's what's needed to be able to advance gender equality.
Uh, Ma'am, the questions has been shifted to another sector. So the question is, I'm combining two of the questions. The first question is employment in agriculture, small industries, and other industries impact for COVID-19 pandemic. Give comment on this. And the second one is, what are the opportunities and financial facilities available for women entrepreneurs?
Okay. The second question, I wouldn't know specifics of what are the opportunities and programs available for women entrepreneurs. I mean, there have been the very standard programs that have been done for the last 20 years. The problem has been the scale of investment in these programs has often been insufficient. It's usually just we do it as an exercise, public relations exercise, that we're doing something for women. Um, so the credit facilities, how significant are they to actually address the credit needs of poor women, is something that needs to be looked at. There may be other experts who can give you more information on that aspect. Agriculture, I don't know about fisheries, but agriculture has been obviously severely impacted by COVID-19. Um, and it's across Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. So agriculture is impacted, and we need to be looking more seriously what has happened in terms of farmers and rural communities' ability to have livelihood. So this is something that needs to be looked at more seriously. All right.
Ma'am, the next question is two or three questions, more two or three more questions, ma'am.
Okay.
Uh, Without wasting the time, we'll be covering this. COVID has hit hard the women employment in hospitality sector, saleswomen, and even the marginal workers. Do you think that the only rural women are more worse than urban women on the impact of COVID?
No, in fact, in some places it is that the impact has been more on urban women than rural women. I think we just need to look at the data very specifically to understand who is impacted the most. But we do know that urban women are definitely impacted because there are many of these sectors that have been hit hardest by COVID 19. Simply think about it. COVID 19, what has it done? And what has the lockdown done? It's not only just employment, it has affected consumption, right? Consumption has declined. And when consumption declines, then it's these sectors that are affected. So you have hospitality, sales, wholesale, etc., that have been significantly affected. And this is across the world. And across the world, what we see is uh, much of the employment in these sectors has been in the urban areas. The employment in rural areas, which is in within the informal sectors of agriculture or fisheries or small handicrafts, etc., have suffered. But this modern economy is largely is what has suffered in COVID-19.
Ma'am, additionally, we have only two questions. The first one is having social care infrastructure and having public and private sectors to operate, does it mean making care work a professional work?
Okay, so no, it's not just about making care work a professional work. Definitely, I think care work should be professional work. It should be remunerated. It should be regulated, right? But the what I'm saying about public and private is that the usual question that's raised when you say there should be investment in public investment in social care infrastructure is where is the money going to come from? So I'm saying that we have to think about the role, the responsibility of the private sector, which benefits from this unpaid care work, needs to be taxed to contribute, to invest in the social care infrastructure. And it's not invest as another private industry, which is a profit generating mechanism, but invest in terms of actually providing the funding for it. We had labor laws in India where, according under the labor regulations, if a, a place of work had more than 50 employees, that you had to have a creche, right? There was earlier a labor law that did exist, and having creches at places of employment was often seen as something that had to be done, and the cost be borne by the employer. Now, those are the kinds of mechanisms that have to be revived so that we facilitate support for care at the place of work itself. And that's what I mean when I'm saying private sector. Yes, care work also needs to be made professional, um, because once you have more facilities, they have to be regulated, there have to be standards of care, etc. But the fundamental is about who invests in this system, and it should not be for profit. That let me make that very clear.
Very true, ma'am. Very true, ma'am. Actually, we also seen and we are very much evident to this pandemic that only the government hospitals and institutions taken the social responsibility in these healthcare facilities. So it's very true, ma'am. Additionally, the person who asked this question who wants to get a comment in addition to this question that this can be a good initiative for both men and women. However, others may argue that it will have a significant effect on the value system. What is your take on it?
What value system? What value system are you referring to? That the value of what is a man and what is a woman? Right. So is it on values around what masculinity is? Is it not values? So if you want to go back to Hinduism and Dharma and this and that values, then there is something about ultimately, it's about what are we as human beings, not man or woman. What are we as human beings? That why do we have children? Whose responsibility is it to take care of children? It's a this is a human project. We have children because it's part of human society and the reproduction of human society. So the values that have developed over time, saying this is for men, this is for women, are nonsense values. They're not human values. They're values built on inequality to perpetuate unequal thinking, perpetuate various types of inequalities. So, yes, it will shift values, but we need to have a shift in values in a positive direction instead of reinforcing the old values.
Thank you very much, ma'am. The query session is over, and personally, I felt that I have been enlightened a lot. And hope all the participants have gained a lot from this lecture. And I'm sure that they must have been benefited to think about the recent pandemic situation and this domestic violence, and the issues raised by you was very much relevant to this current situation. Like you already highlighted many of the points, like disappropriate burden on migrant workers, gender paying gap, unpaid care workers in home pre and post pandemic time, women's voices, domestic violence, response to COVID-19, sensitive. I'm sure that these all the relevant issues uh, have created a platform for us to think logically about the current society, even in the pandemic, even after the pandemic. And I'm sure, ma'am, your valuable words uh, will give us to think for the moral way to for the society and social responsibilities. And without wasting much time, ma'am, I'm very much thankful to you on behalf of my organizing committee for delivering such a wonderful session and poured us with the rain of knowledge. And we wish you a safe days ahead, ma'am. Please take care, and thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Please take care, ma'am. Ravinderji, can you stop the live from YouTube?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Please take care. You are coughing, coughing a lot. And I'm sure that there is a winter season, but here in India, it's summer. So please take care of yourself.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye, ma'am. Thank you. Ravinder sir, can you disconnect the, can you stop the live from YouTube? Chandan sir, is it stopped?
हाँ मैंने
Can
बोल
you
दिया
check?
है he is the host so he will like discontinue it so just wait for him.
Okay. So, Chandan sir, please call him to inform that please stop the live, because you already told us to inform them. Inform him.
I had called him. He is with us and he I hello.